There is a small island in the cold waters of Penobscot Bay, off the coast of Maine, that looks today like nothing at all. A low mound of pink-gray rock, maybe 125 acres, covered in tangled spruce and black raspberry bushes, with a few rough trails winding through the brush. If you hike across it, you will start to notice strange things in the undergrowth. Stone foundations with nothing on top of them, old wells, rusted iron tools lying where they were dropped, blocks of granite, some half-carved, abandoned mid-cut, and in a quiet corner 2 graves untended, the names worn soft by a century of weather. 100 years ago, this silent island was a roaring town. Hundreds of people lived here. There were homes and a school and a store, and at night, the streets were lit by electric streetlights, out here on a rock in the middle of the bay. This was one of the great granite quarries of America, and the stone cut on this island and the islands around it went into some of the most important buildings the country ever raised. And then, on a single day in 1914, the whole town stopped. The people were carried off with a few hours' notice, and the island was left to the forest. The island is called Hurricane, and the story of how its granite ended up holding up cathedrals and custom houses in America's greatest cities, while the island itself vanished into the brush, is one of the strangest and saddest in New England. So before I take you across the water to it, one ask. If you care about the American places that built the country and were then swallowed by time, subscribe to Sealed America. I find them before they disappear completely. Now let me take you back to when this rock was worth a fortune. The islands of Penobscot Bay, known together as the Fox Islands, sit on an enormous body of beautiful pink-gray granite. For most of human history, that was just the ground. But in the 1820s, people began to understand the quality of the stone beneath the moss, and it launched a boom that would last for nearly 100 years. The largest island, Vinalhaven, became one of the great quarrying centers in all of Maine. And the reason the boom worked so well here was simple. The granite was right next to the sea. You could cut a massive block of stone, load it onto a sailing vessel at the water's edge, and ship it down the coast to the growing cities of America far more easily than you could haul stone overland. And America in those years had an enormous appetite for granite. The country was building on a grand scale, raising monuments and public buildings meant to last for the ages, and the architects wanted stone. Strong, beautiful, permanent stone. The granite cut on these Maine islands traveled to Boston, to New York, to Chicago, and beyond, into the walls and columns and steps of buildings that were meant to stand forever. Perhaps the most famous example of all stands in New York City, where the colossal stone columns of the great Cathedral of St. John the Divine were quarried from this Maine granite. Enormous shafts of rock cut and shaped by island hands. Custom houses, federal buildings, post offices, bridges, monuments across the eastern United States carried the stone of these islands inside them. When Americans of that era wanted something built to last forever, the stone often came from right here. Stop and think about the scale of what these islands sent out into the world. The great columns of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine are among the largest pieces of cut granite ever quarried in America. Enormous monolithic shafts, and they were torn from this Maine rock and shaped by island hands before being shipped hundreds of miles south. Up and down the eastern seaboard, the courthouses and the custom houses and the grand public buildings of the age stood on Fox Island granite. Every one of those buildings was a kind of message, a statement in stone that the institution inside it was permanent, solid, here to stay. And the permanence they buying was quarried on a windswept island in Penobscot Bay by immigrant stonecutters that most of the country never knew existed. If you are still with me, take 1 second and subscribe. The story of the people who cut the stone that built America only survives if we keep telling it, and the channel only reaches the people who would care when enough of you tap the button. One tap. Now let me tell you about the man who built a town on a bare rock. In 1870, a Civil War general named Davis Tilson bought Hurricane Island just west of Vinalhaven. Tilson had already made money in the limestone quarries around Rockland, and he understood the granite business. On this small, windswept island, he built something remarkable from almost nothing. He formed the Hurricane Island Granite Company, and he cleared the land and raised an entire town to serve it. Homes for the workers and their families, a school for the children, a store. All the buildings needed to cut, shape, and ship granite. And astonishingly, for an isolated island in the 1800s, electric streetlights along its paths, the work drew people from all over. Many were local Mainers, but General Tilson also brought in immigrant stonecutters from across Europe, from Sweden and Finland, from Ireland and Scotland and Italy, skilled men who knew how to coax shapes out of the hard granite. At its height, the village on Hurricane Island held hundreds of people, a whole community living on the bare rock, their lives built entirely around the stone. And the work itself was brutal and beautiful. Cutting granite in those days was done largely by hand and muscle and skill. Men drilled lines of holes into the rock and split it along the grain. They hauled the massive blocks with the help of enormous specialized wagons, drawn by teams of oxen or horses, the heavy stone slung beneath the axles. They carved and finished the blocks, sometimes into plain building stone, sometimes into intricate columns and ornaments. The tools of the trade became legends in their own right. To move the colossal blocks, the quarrymen used a strange and massive wagon called a gallimander, a towering wooden frame on great iron-shod wheels that could straddle a block of granite and lift it clear of the ground on chains so that teams of oxen could drag the impossible weight down to the water. The men who cut and shaped the stone were craftsmen in the truest sense, reading the grain of the rock, splitting it clean along invisible lines, working it with hammer and chisel into the precise forms that architects in faraway cities had drawn. It was dangerous work, full of dust that ruined lungs and stone that crushed limbs, and it was skilled work that took years to master. The granite did not give itself up easily, and then the granite hauling barges and sailing vessels carried the finished stone away across the water, down the coast toward the cities where it would be raised into something permanent. For decades, Hurricane Island was prosperous, busy, and proud. It even became its own town for a time, separate from Vinalhaven, a granite kingdom on a rock in the bay. But a threat was rising that no amount of skill could overcome, and it was the same enemy that ended so many of these stories. A new material. In the early years of the 20th century, concrete and steel began to replace cut granite as the way America built its biggest structures. Reinforced concrete was cheaper, faster, and more flexible than carving and hauling solid blocks of stone. At the same time, the railroads had spread across the country, and stone could now be moved cheaply overland from inland quarries, which undercut the island quarries that depended on the sea. The whole Maine Island granite industry, which had thrived because stone was best shipped by water, suddenly found the world shifting beneath it. The great age of cut granite was ending, and the islands felt it first. Hurricane Island began to suffer periodic shutdowns. The boom was sliding toward its close. And then came the autumn of 1914, and the strange, sudden, almost unbelievable way it all ended. Hurricane Island had landed a contract to supply granite for a breakwater being built down in Rockport, Massachusetts. It was the kind of job that had kept the island alive for decades. But in the fall of 1914, one of the last shipments of that granite, the heavy stone blocks bound for the breakwater, went down in a storm at sea. The vessel and its cargo were lost to the water, and then, just days later, the company's foreman, a man named John Landers, died of typhoid fever, and with that, on that very day, the quarrying stopped. The combination of the failing industry, the lost shipment, and the sudden death of the foreman who held the operation together was simply too much. The decision was made. and it was carried out with shocking speed. The residents of Hurricane Island were evacuated with little more than a few hours' notice. People left so fast that the accounts of it are haunting. Tools were laid down beside half-finished carvings, never to be picked up again. Houses were abandoned, with tables still set for dinner and pictures still hanging on the walls. A town of hundreds, lived in for more than 40 years, emptied in an afternoon. What happened next is almost as remarkable as the leaving. The people of nearby Vinalhaven, just across the narrow sound, did not let all that material go to waste. They came over and salvaged everything they possibly could, personal belongings, fixtures, anything of value. And then they began to take the buildings themselves apart. The lumber and the materials were carried the short distance across the water to be reused elsewhere, on Vinalhaven and in the neighboring towns. Piece by piece, the abandoned village was disassembled and carried away, until there was almost nothing left standing on the island at all. And then the forest came. In the century since, the spruce trees and the brambles have grown back over almost everything. The roads are gone, the houses are gone, carried off or rotted away. The granite works are gone. What remains today for a hiker willing to push through the brush is only the bones. Stone foundations that mark where buildings stood, a few old wells, some carved and half-carved blocks of granite left where they lay, and those 2 untended graves, almost the only markers left of the hundreds of people who once made their lives here. The thriving town, with its streetlights and its school and its hundreds of workers, has been almost completely erased, reclaimed by the same wild Maine landscape it was carved out of. On Vinalhaven, across the Sound, the memory survives a little better. One of those great Galamander wagons, the towering frames that once hauled the granite to the shore, was kept and restored, and it stands now as a monument in the town, sheltered from the weather, a reminder of the industry that once defined these islands. Several of the old quarries on Vinalhaven have filled with rainwater and become beloved swimming holes, deep and cold and clear, where children now leap from the same granite ledges their great-grandfathers split apart for a living. The stone is still everywhere underfoot, but the great age that cut it and shipped it out to build a nation is gone, remembered now by a wagon under a roof, a few flooded pits, and the silent ghost of a town on the island next door. I keep thinking about the strange unfairness at the heart of this one. The whole purpose of Hurricane Island, the entire reason it existed, was to make things that would last forever. The men who lived here cut permanent stone for permanent monuments. Their granite went into cathedrals and government buildings and bridges, structures specifically chosen to outlast the centuries, and a great many of them are still standing today, solid and proud in the great cities of America. The stone these islanders cut by hand will likely outlast every one of us, but the island that produced it, the town and the homes and the people, vanished almost without a trace. They built permanence for everyone else, and kept none of it for themselves. The villain here was never a person. It was the slow, unstoppable change of the world. Concrete and steel rising to replace cut stone, the railroads undercutting the sea, the simple obsolescence of an entire way of building, and then, on top of all that, a cruel run of bad luck in a single season, a shipment lost to a storm and a foreman lost to a fever, that turned a slow decline into an overnight ending. Hurricane Island did nothing wrong. It cut the finest granite in America with skill and pride and shipped it out to build a country. The country just stopped needing the stone, and the island had nothing else to offer. So Hurricane Island sits out there, still a low green mound in Penobscot Bay, quiet and overgrown, visited now mostly by students at a small science center and by the occasional hiker who stumbles on a foundation in the brush and wonders what it was. The granite these islanders cut still stands in the cathedrals and the cities, holding up the monuments of America, exactly as permanent as they meant it to be. And the island that gave it, the town of hundreds that emptied in an afternoon and was carried away board by board, has almost completely disappeared, marked now by nothing but stone foundations, a few wells, and 2 forgotten graves under the spruce. The Maine Granite Island that built America's monuments, abandoned in a single day in 1914, stripped to its foundations, and given back to the forest, its stone stands forever in distant cities. The island itself is a ghost,